Hello and welcome to our monthly podcast series, In Conversation With. Hello and welcome to the Global Cosmetics News podcast. Today we're going to talk about sustainable beauty. And first, it's my pleasure to introduce our panellists. We have Chris Sayner, Vice President Corporate Sustainability at Croda, Neil Farmer, Consultant at Neil Farmer Associates and former Chairman of the Institute of Packaging, Chris Rayner of Leeds University, whose spin-out Keraol is behind the Dr. Craft Bio brand, and Stephen Clarke, Head of Communications at TerraCyle Europe. Welcome, everybody. So let's start by talking about the situation now and laying out the key issues in your various sides of the industry. So if we start from Chris, an ingredients perspective, do you want to just talk to us a little bit about what you're doing at the moment?
Most of the discussions I have with home and personal care consumer products companies focus on all things environmental, reducing carbon footprint, life cycle analysis, water, waste, and increased use of renewable raw materials, moving away from petrochemical. But then, of course, when we're talking about renewable raw material feedstocks for our ingredients, then we have to be very aware of the sustainability credentials of the supply chains. And then you get into the social accountability, which is clearly very important in supply chains, and no deforestation, which there's an extreme focus on palm, and the industry is really managing this very well now. But of course, any other feedstock material, plant-based feedstock material, there could be deforestation implications. So that's in a nutshell, that's the major part of the discussions that we have with the large personal care consumer product companies.
Great, thank you. And Neil, do you want to talk to us a little bit about packaging?
We're going through interesting times in the packaging industry. I've always been a great advocate of all the things that we should be doing. Biodegradability, compostability, using plant-based materials, extending shelf life and making packaging better than it has been ever before. I'm pleased to say since the start of the year, there's been a greater emphasis on this than I've ever known in my career, and that goes 40 years or so. Almost every day there's been some announcement or statement since Christmas about a new initiative that one of the consumer goods companies is doing or a government system, or there's been something really exciting that's made us think, wow, maybe we haven't been doing enough. Maybe we should be doing more. Everyone will talk about Blue Planet, about the Attenborough programme, and that perhaps was the catalyst for more thought. Certainly governments, I think, are starting to think more. Perhaps the governments, our current government of the UK, didn't always think about plastics and packaging waste as an important criteria for their policy programmes, but that's all changed. So I'm excited by the challenges, but I'm under no illusion that we've got a hell of a lot more work to do, particularly in recycling, which is one of the big issues in the plastics industry. And until we get that improved to a higher level, and we sort out the waste systems in more separation of good from bad plastics, as I call it, we're going to see this gradual movement, but it's going to take time. So I'm excited, but so certainly the industry is facing huge challenges at the moment.
And which leads us neatly on to you, Stephen. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the waste management perspective at the moment?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it is very interesting times. There has been a lot more interest in things, and I do think Blue Planet 2 has been a massive catalyst. We've seen a lot more interest, a lot more brands wanting to talk to us, a lot more consumers wanting to sign up to our recycling programs. One of the problems for recycling is we feel a lot of consumers are disconnected from recycling. There's too much confusion about what can be recycled and what can't be recycled. We work with lots of brands to recycle types of waste packaging that are hard to recycle. And the reason that they're not normally recycled is because the economics don't work. So things are recycled because they're revenue generating. Anything that's hard to recycle or costly isn't recycled because it costs you more to collect it, separate it, and then recycle it than what you can sell the end raw material for. But it is a massive opportunity for cosmetics companies to differentiate themselves because consumers do vote with their wallet. So if companies are incorporating different types of recycled content into their packaging, there's a term that we call storied plastics. And that's a plastic that's got a particularly good story behind it. So we're working with the likes of Procter and Gamble to use ocean plastics and beach plastics into Head and Shoulders bottles, into fairy bottles, and a number of other lines coming out. So there are really exciting times, and it's how a brand sort of latches onto this and how they can use it to maximise their opportunities.
And lastly, Chris, do you want to talk to us a little bit about, from an end product perspective?
Okay. So I'll talk about sort of Keraol and Dr. Kraft that came out of that. So we're kind of unusual as a company in that we came out of the university, and it was actually sustainability that brought me and my colleague Richard Blackburn together. We both have mutual research interests, but actually the sustainability was the common theme, if you like. But probably about 15 years ago, we were working together, and what we effectively did initially was to develop new ingredients. But now what we're doing is moving where we're actually applying those ingredients into formulations. And because these are natural ingredients, they're actually quite different to what everybody else has been using. Yeah? And so if you understand those ingredients, you can start to then build products around them. And that's really what we think has to happen going forward. You know, if we're using more renewable ingredients, it's understanding the chemistry behind them and then putting them into the market where, you know, they can actually do something different and be more sustainable, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Talking about all of these exciting things, I agree with you. It's exciting times, and every single day at Global Cosmetics News, we're getting press releases in. But also a lot of the press releases are patting ourselves on the back, saying we've won this award, we've got this, we've achieved this goal. Do you think we're almost not being ambitious enough, or we haven't been ambitious enough in the past? And therefore, when on the one point of view, we're getting news in such as sun creams ruining the oceans and microbeads, you know, we're talking about glitter and all these different elements of the cosmetics industry that are causing active harm to our environment, that perhaps we haven't been looking at it or being ambitious enough from the start. Why are these issues continuing to snowball? Why are we hearing so much this year? Is it simply that science has caught up? Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, we've used certain plastic materials for a hell of a long time. You know, we've been using petrol-based materials as long as I can remember and before. And I think now the time has come that packaging has got to do more than just perform. It's got to do all the things we were talking about. End of life cycle, all the things about recovery materials, the plastics oceans, the waste. These are things we are definitely having to address more. But if I can just take materials, in the last 10 years, I've noticed that the consumer good industry is prepared to invest in new materials. Only so far, because it hasn't always been an exponential growth in bioplastics and materials that have got great qualities, but perhaps cost more. And I think the issue now we've got is some of these materials could be more expensive. And I'm talking about, for example, PET, which is now ubiquitous. Everyone uses PET. They didn't, but now they're using more volume production, more PET capacity coming on stream. Tremendous. But PET will only go so far. And then we look at the new generation of materials that might be just totally bio-based, not a percentage bio-based. And those are the materials we're starting off with now. I'm talking about materials like PEF, a pilot plant for which is starting up in Amsterdam in the not too distant future. That could well replace PET. It's totally bio-based. It's got a material quality performance that improves on PET, but it costs. And I think we're back to this issue once again about startup costs, about investment in infrastructure, about getting all these things in place before the volume really takes off. So from my viewpoint, we should invest more in these technologies because they're the future. If you can improve shelf life, if you can make the material perform better than existing materials, that's got to be where we're going. But, you know, pilot plants are pilot plants, and then we go to a reference plant, and then we go to volume production. And that is 4, 5, 6, 7 years away. And will it ever take over? Well, it will eventually, I guess, but it's taking time. So my big beef would be greater investment to drive these technologies forward and make sure we have cost-effective solutions to improve the quality of the product on the shelf.
And in terms of cost, what are we talking when we get to the consumer side of things? How much extra would a product cost them?
Yes. Well, it's not going to be a massive amount. But in the market at the moment, with cost being one of the biggest drivers in consumer purchasing decisions, and with the supermarkets merging and becoming fewer and fewer, and cost is a big issue at the moment, it's driving the whole market in terms of that direction. We're only talking about a few pence probably, you know, but that can be a big differentiator, and that can be the difference between purchasing and not purchasing. I always say you walk into a store and it's the 7-second blink of an eye moment. that moment when you walk in and you look at the products on the shelf and the consumer has that instant purchasing decision. And 60% of all purchasing decisions are made on the shelf as you walk into that store. So we've got to get packaging that's attractive, that will make the consumer, I want to buy this, but equally, you've got to make it perform better. And if it adds a few pence to that price and a few pence to the product on the shelf, it might not always be the best decision to make.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the attractiveness of the packaging harks back to what you were saying, Stephen, about how attractive the packaging is for recycling companies, whether it's got a worth. For example, I was recently watching something about black packaging, which is particularly used in foods. You're trying to make something look attractive in the shelf, but at the same time, you're making it into an environmental disaster. How do we reconcile those two needs for companies? How do we make it cost effective and worth it for them to create a product that's also good for the environment?
One of the things that was just mentioned was investment. There also needs to be an investment in infrastructure. It's all well and good creating new sort of bioplastics and compostable products, but if there's not the infrastructure to recycle these materials at a national level, then it won't work. And currently there isn't the infrastructure out there. So if more products were compostable, you'd have to have it under the exact correct conditions for it to compost. And at the minute, there's very few sites in the UK that could actually do that. One of the other things that there's been lots of reporting about is consumers do say that they're willing to pay more for sustainable brands or switch to brands that are giving you the sort of correct recyclable materials or incorporating different types of recycled plastic. So I think that's a big thing as well. It's consumers say they're willing to do it, and they do vote with their wallets. So, and
in terms of on shelf, for example, if we choose different colours of plastics or choose plastics that are better in terms of where it's going to end up from a waste management perspective, how do we reconcile those two needs to make it stand out, to make the product look attractive, sexy, essentially? I mean, don't mean to be rude, but compostable packaging is not exactly sexy from a 2-second look at the shelf. No. Which shampoo am I going to buy? So how do we reconcile those two?
It's all about the messaging that brands use then, just to show that their product is a good option. That's the thing. If consumers are willing to buy sustainable brands, it's up to consumer product companies to be clever with their marketing.
And if both Chris's would like to talk us through a little bit about formulating products, how are we getting ingredients that are fine from a end? Are we looking at sort of post-consumer perspective after it's being washed down the drain, as well as what we make it from in the first place?
Please, may I answer your first question before I answer that one?
You may.
The earlier question, Georgina, where you said, are we doing enough, we as an industry, talking about personal care, congratulate ourselves for winning awards? The sustainability agenda or sustainability reporting in personal care isn't 20 years old. It started in 99, 2000 with reports published by big home and personal care products, Unilever, Procter and Gamble, Henkel, and then through the 2000s, all the other major personal care consumer product companies came on. So it's relatively new. It's not 20 years old, and we need to reflect on that and the momentum that has gathered in the industry to where we are today, still not 20 years on. The attention, the resource, the level of questioning, the detail that major personal care consumer product companies ask of their ingredient suppliers today is extraordinary. Years ago, ingredient suppliers were asked, is your ingredient animal-derived or is it plant-derived? Now, there's a whole set of questions about the integrity of the supply chain hygiene. Clearly, safety has always been a prerequisite, and biodegradability, ecotoxicity. I think we have to recognize that certainly the major companies are doing an enormous amount of work in sustainability. And I've been following an initiative, SPOT, Sustainable Products Optimization Tool, developed by the number one personal care company in the world, L'Oreal. And their science is taking this to another level, to the point at which I read that even the EU is taking an interest in the protocols that L'Oreal have developed. So is there more we can do? Certainly. But are we doing enough? I would just answer that question by saying there is an extraordinary amount of time, effort, money, and resource going into sustainability in personal care consumer products. Sorry, I forgot your second question. But I've said my piece now.
I was saying, essentially, have we been looking at things from the perspective of what happens when we're producing them? So sustainability from that perspective. So what you're saying, energy, water.
The environmental metrics, they're built into our processes. And we, in Croda, since 2007, really, but we've recorded everything since 2012. We've followed the 12 principles of green chemistry in product design. And, Paul Anastas and John Warner, who wrote the 12 principles 20 years ago, were perhaps, Chris knows much more about this than I do, but they were perhaps ahead of the time, really, because they've now gathered a lot of recognition and are extensively used in the industry. But yes, the 12 principles, they are absolutely to be followed in product design and synthesis.
So we're following the principles in terms of what happens before the product leaves the factory. How are we tackling what happens to it afterwards? Well, I know there's a question mark over the whole Hawaii sun cream.
Well, in our company, we do a lot of formulation work, but really the product design, the finished cosmetic personal care product, the expertise lies within the manufacturing companies who have extensive resources and ensuring the safety and the integrity and the environmental fate of product that goes down the drain, or whether it's leave on.
If I can perhaps add, I think probably one of the opportunities is to actually be a bit more innovative in how you think about the product. So, for example, shampoos and conditioners, everybody is thinking about shampoo and conditioner and just a different sort of bottle, whereas actually, can we redo the shampoo and conditioner just totally different? So you don't need a bottle, or it could be in a box, or it could be like a bar of soap or whatever. So actually being much more innovative in how you actually develop the products themselves, rather than just saying, "Oh, here's a product, let's just change the packaging." So I think whole new concepts there are coming through to the market, and I think they will be very important going to the future. One of the things I think is very important. We've all seen Blue Planet, mentioned it already. That's a very visible thing that the consumer can see. But there are numerous other effects that we're having that are much less visible, but actually will one day become much more visible. And we have to be very wary of those. Yeah. And particularly, if you think about the developing world, where people may want to aspire to a lifestyle like us in the West, they're going to want to use cosmetics just like everybody else, and the burden on the planet is going to be even more kind of reach unsustainable levels. So again, we've got to rethink things, I think, rather than just tweaking things or just incremental advances. I think some more fundamental changes are probably going to need to happen in the next 5 or 10 years to really make an impact on this.
I think that a lot of consumers would be quite surprised to find out that there was plastic in their foundation in the form of microbeads. I certainly, even though I work in the industry and write about it every single day, or 3 days a week, was quite surprised to find out that some of my powders, obviously I knew that exfoliants contain microbeads, but I was quite surprised to find out that some of the powders in my makeup bag contain plastic also. Do you think that we are doing a good job at self-regulation from that point of view? Because the industry was up in arms when the government suggested outlawing microbeads.
I think it's bizarre that anybody ever thought it was a good idea to have lots of little bits of plastic floating around in the environment. Because, pretty much for cosmetics, everything you do ends up down the sink in some shape or other. So I would say it was probably not the best product to launch. Somebody had made quite a bit of money on the back of it, I think, probably. So they saw an opportunity there. But I think those sorts of things we have to stamp out really quickly. But, there will be other things like that where people perhaps haven't really thought through all the possible implications of launching a particular product, which comes back to bite them later on. So thinking all those things through much more carefully, I think is very important.
From that perspective, that in terms of microbeads, the government's had to step in, and certainly in this country and in several around the world, microbeads have either been outlawed or are being for rinse-off products. Not so much for leave-on, but as you say, everything ends up down the drain eventually. Do you think that as an industry, we are doing a good job of self-regulation, or do you think the government should step in? And I know that we were saying outside, Chris, you'll have something to say on this, that actually the government's behind the industry on several of these points. Do you think so?
I do think that the personal care industry, or there are some industry-leading sustainability programs in personal care. we were talking just before we sat down for our interview about plastics, but I'm afraid that's not an area of expertise for me. I just did some research recently. There are two other gentlemen around this table who know much more than I will ever know. But my point was about the 8 or 10 companies consumer product companies who have got together as a consortia to target moving away from single-use plastic by 2025. And in my limited research, I just compared and contrasted that with Her Majesty's Treasury, who put together a report that was investigating the financial implications of moving away from single-use plastic by 2042. So there you contrast industry targeting 2025 with our elected government talking about 2042. But Steve and Neil would have a much more sensible view, perhaps, than I have.
So can you add? So just start with Stephen.
I don't think it's just it's just an issue for the cosmetics industry. It's all industries, and I think there is far too much self-regulation. I think that this problem has really come to everyone's attention in the last year, increasingly. I think there needs to be more direct action, quickly. The longer you leave self-regulation, the worse the problem is going to become. There were a couple of interesting facts and figures you might have heard over the last year. These came from the World Economic Forum. So there's going to be more plastics and fish in the oceans by 2050 is something that's been widely talked about. And another one of their reports showed that 95% of the value of plastic packaging material, which is 80 to 120 billion pounds a year globally, is lost to the economy after the first use. It either goes to landfill or to incineration. That's a staggering thought. And one of the reasons for that is people are confused. What can you recycle? What can you not recycle? And for this industry in particular, these are UK figures. In the kitchen, 90% of recyclable material is actually recycled, and in the bathroom, it's only 50%. And that's because people are confused, and it's inconvenient. You have various recycling bins in your kitchen. In your bathroom, you probably have one bin. You pop everything in it. Do you put it into the right bin into the kitchen to go outside with your curbside? It appears most consumers don't, because they're too confused. So if you were to put in, let's say, a shampoo bottle with a pump lid, that will be taken out because the pump lid, the trigger head, is a mix of different plastics. So if you take it off, it'll get recycled. If you leave it on, it'll be factored out by one of the separation processes. So there is so much confusion because all different sort of regions and councils, some will accept some plastics and some won't accept some plastics. People just don't know what they can and what they can't recycle.
And to me, that sounds like we've almost got two things that need to happen ASAP here. Firstly, the industry needs to stop creating confusing packaging. So we shouldn't really have pumps that aren't recyclable. Surely technology is caught up enough now where we could create one single bottle that's all recyclable. And secondly, that governments should standardise across the whole country. Obviously, that's easier in a small country like the UK than it is in a huge country like the United States of America.
Yeah.
But standardise what can be recycled. What do you think, Neil? Has technology caught up? Can we just make bottles that are recyclable now?
Well, the answer is we're getting there, but why distinct bottles? One of the things the last 6 months has brought home to me is that now we are being more ambitious to look at alternative materials. L'Oreal in the States have brought out a new bathroom pack, shampoo and other products that's in paperboard corrugated. It's a new launch. I've no idea how it's going to perform, but it says to me that business has been thinking over the last few months about, okay, we've gone so far with plastics, what are the alternatives? And I know from colleagues in Europe that the corrugated market is going like a train at the moment. Corrugated board is popular.
Yeah.
And its score could be that the issue has been raised to a level whereby we see that the plastic pack, as it stands, perhaps has gone as far as it can. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I'm not the judge of that. But there are other alternatives, and some of these other options, like corrugated paper and board, is certainly now more on the table than it ever was a year or two ago. So I think we are looking more at new options. Going back to the points that's been made very eloquently about education, it is totally a consumer education problem, in my opinion, that we've somehow got to get people thinking about how we dispose, how we get rid of, where we put it, which bin or which box it goes in. picture last bank holiday weekend of a beach in the south of England strewn with waste and products just been left there after a lovely weekend in the sun. And we're not educating the consumer to think correctly, to get rid of stuff. Maybe they don't know where they should be putting it. Maybe that's a job for us in the industry. But until we get these issues right, it's going to be a continuing problem going forward. As regards self-regulation, yes, my view is that the government should do more. There should be more coherence. There must be more clarification in exactly what it is in their policy and where it's going. As I said before, we didn't get much about it till this last 6 to 8 months. And now all of a sudden they are talking more about plastics and about the environment and about disposal of products. And the Environment Secretary has been very outspoken about that, and I applaud that. But we are doing a bit ourselves. There's a UK Plastic Pact, which has been announced in the last few months with several major FMCG companies. Ellen MacArthur's involved, the foundation. That there's all of a sudden an awareness that we perhaps haven't done enough. And now we've got to do more to help control, regulate ourselves. Because if we don't, the EU will do it, the national governments will do it, and by 2030, as far as the EU is concerned, all single-use plastics will be banned. Is that good or bad? Remains to be seen, but at least it's a target. And I think this is what we need, more specific targets about what we're going to achieve by a certain date, rather than nebulous 2020, 2040, 2045s, which are manifestly absurd at the moment.
Mm-hmm. In terms of consumers, can we liken it to the plastic bag charge, for example, that's been bought in the UK? Beforehand, supermarkets always gave you 5p if you bought in your own bag. However, when it became that you have to pay 5p for this, that's when the real change started. Do we need something like that? I mean, I know L'Oreal, for example, has introduced refillable shampoo bottles. Yeah. What you were saying, Stephen, about needing the money that's spent on single-use plastic being lost to the economy because it's incinerated. Do we need to make these plastic bottles an item of value that you can take in and refill or swap, or that they cost themselves separately, that you have to pay for the bottle separately to the product that's in it?
It certainly helps, and we do work with some major retailers and brands on take-back schemes. So we work with the likes of L'Occitane, we work with Kiehl's, we work with quite a few companies around the world where consumers bring back their empty product. You get a stamp on a card, and then when you've got a certain number of ticks, you get either money off or you get a free product. And so that's the thing, you're incentivizing the consumer to recycle something. Mm-hmm. With the whole variety of different mixes of products. So, if you bring back, let's say, a lipstick or, I don't know, a mascara or whatever it might be, there's so many different types of material in that. It would be very hard at the minute with the way national infrastructure is with curbside collections to be able to recycle it that level. So, the fact that retailers and consumer goods companies are kind of looking at ways to recycle this material, we think is a really good thing. We also work with the likes of Garnier, and they will run free recycling programs. So anybody can sign up and you send the product back in, we recycle it, and it raises money for schools, charities or non-profits. So there's a whole host of different ways companies can look at it. There's whole different ways manufacturers can do their piece as well. But it's a thing of, while there is no sort of government-led initiative on it with particularly near target dates, I think it's how everybody does their bit, whether it's manufacturers and consumers.
From that perspective, we're almost moving towards sort of closed-loop consumer model. John Lewis has just announced a big initiative for those listeners who don't live in the UK. That's a UK department store has announced an initiative whereby you bring back clothing, they pay you for it. We've got a US T-shirt service called 4 Days who sell T-shirts, and when you send back your T-shirt, they use that T-shirt to make another one and send it back to you. Not exactly the same T-shirt, obviously. Do you think that we need to move a little bit more towards that kind of goal, Chris?
Yes, absolutely. I think the more we can do it in those sorts of areas to encourage people to recycle is very important. Okay, there is self-regulation in certain aspects of the industry, but there is a lot of regulation in other aspects. And certainly talking as someone who would be, say, an ingredient supplier, for example, there's a whole range of European regulation, so REACH and cosmetics directives and all that sort of stuff that you have to fit into to actually be able to, say, launch new products and things like that. And one of the problems with that regulation is it really does stifle innovation. And I think there are real issues around some of that regulation, which goes beyond what the sort of things you're already talking about, which are real barriers to actually introducing new products, which might overcome some of the problems that we have with the existing products. So, that the actual entry cost, for example, for a new cosmetic ingredient is huge. Yeah, and certainly, innovative small companies like Keraol or Dr. Kraft find that very, very difficult to actually get a new product actually through regulatory procedures. So it's actually quite different to the sorts of things you were talking about before, but there are some fairly strict regulations that you have to get through to launch new products. Yeah, I mean, Croda will know all about these sorts of things. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more other Chris?
REACH, I mean, we started talking about REACH, I think, in 2004. Happily, we have just completed our final submission and filing to REACH, which was 10 years of work. It was enormous. Yes, there is a barrier to entry. We work in an area of chemistry where there are lower hurdles to polymers, for example. But then there is an argument that says, when you look at the Inky Dictionary, the Formulator's Bible, the dictionary that contains all of the monographs for cosmetic ingredients, there are 21,000 monographs in there, cross-referencing 68,000 trade and technical names from 3,000 suppliers in 100 countries. Arguably, I always say that because I always then follow it by saying, if you don't like complexity, the personal care industry is not for you. Because complexity has been used as an argument for not doing things in the past. Our focus in Croda is on more and more on life cycle analysis. It's neutralizing the carbon. It's producing and delivering ingredients with the lowest possible carbon footprint. Every year there's a Green Biz report published in the US, and there's a section in there from True Cost that talks about the natural capital in all types of products, and including home and personal care products, where looking on a cradle to gate basis, so cradle, the very source of the raw materials and packaging, and the gate being the consumer product manufacturing companies, factory gate, sending out the shampoo or conditioner, they calculate that 95% of the environmental burden, the natural capital, sits within the supply chain. Only 5% sits within the confines of the consumer product manufacturing company. So when consumer product companies talk about being carbon balanced or carbon neutral, they're only dealing with their 5%. That is the tip of the iceberg. The bigger part of the iceberg below the waterline is the 95% that sits in the supply chain. So our focus is on Croda is in reducing or eliminating our carbon footprint, because that carbon in the supply chain, the so-called Scope 3 carbon for a personal care company, doesn't have the focus that it needs to have. It is the elephant in the room. And if you look, as has been published recently, maybe I think you published some of the information on the life cycle analysis has been done, cradle to grave, on things like shampoos. It illustrates how much burden there is in raw materials and packaging. And then, of course, there's the consumer use phase, where we step into the shower with our product, where there is also a carbon burden. So that's our focus is on mitigating against the carbon in our ingredients.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of takes back to what we were saying at the beginning, in that there's a lot of backpatting that goes on with the consumer companies in particular, and they like to shout about how they've met all their goals. But as you say, they're only dealing with that 5%. They're not dealing with what happens when it gets into my bathroom, and they're not dealing with what happens beforehand. So it's easy for them to pat themselves on the back.
Oh, yes, but I have to say that certainly the larger consumer product companies are challenging us, and we are rising to that challenge. It is important, and if carbon taxation develops, as it inevitably will, more than it is today, which is loose change, really, if the growing consensus is correct that it is $50 a tonne by 2020 and $100 a tonne by 2030, then it will become expensive and somebody will pay. Supply chains will pay. Chris will know much more about this than I do, but it is right, and I'm moving away from the personal care consumer product industry, it is right that the most carbon-intensive, carbon-rich processes should pay for that environmental burden.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think people really realise how much the whole sort of energy scenario is going to change over the next 10, 20 years. The UK is supposed to be carbon neutral by 2050. If that really is going to happen, then there's going to be some huge changes in the way we generate energy, but also the way we think about CO2 emissions. Yeah? And everything has CO2 emissions embedded in it, especially cosmetics. Yeah, and so that will impact on the cost, on the manufacture of all of these things, and it will feed through over the next probably 10 years or so, something like that. It will be very, very important. And the planet, or the UK or wherever, we have a big shot to the system coming over the next 10 or 20 years where all of this starts to come into play, because if we're really going to meet our Paris climate change obligations and things like that, there's got to be huge changes in the way we do things.
Mm-hmm. Is that where something, for example, byproduct beauty is a winner, in that if you're using Ribena byproduct, presumably you can't take responsibility for the CO2 thing because it would be a waste material otherwise?
Well, what normally happens is the byproduct from Ribena actually is a fertiliser, so it goes on land, yeah. But yes, all of those sorts of things, if a manufacturer or somebody's taking the time to grow something and use fertiliser or whatever, and you actually can get added benefit from that process. So you have a waste product and you can actually use it for something that creates value, creates function and replaces something else that would have to be prepared from a fossil fuel, for example. Then all those sorts of things do become very, very important. Yeah, I mean, we have another product that we're going to launch very soon, which actually uses a biopolymer from seaweed, actually in hairsprays, and we've done a full life cycle analysis on that, compared it to current hairspray formulation, PVP, vinyl acetate, yeah, and actually the renewable biopolymer comes out way ahead, simply because you're not doing all the chemical processing that you would normally do for a chemical manufacturer from petrochemicals, essentially. And so those sorts of things, I think what Chris said is very important. Looking at the overall environmental impact, the carbon footprint, everything of each product is very, very important. And I think we were asked to think about what we would like to do if money was no object. And one of the things I would recommend, for everything, is that we actually really understand the life cycle of everything. And then, there will be things that actually have a relatively low impact on the environment. Fine, let's use those. But there will be things also that where we'll see that they have a significant carbon footprint that really we shouldn't be using those, and they should be phased out as soon as we can.
So let's open that question to the floor. If money is no object, what's the single thing that you would do? Let's start with you, Chris.
Well, I can tell you money is not no object.
Sorry.
That makes sense. We have finite resources in our company, but to support exactly what Chris is saying, life cycle analysis and carbon footprinting is a priority for us. And water, of course. We're talking about natural capital, and there's an increasing recognition of natural capital in its entirety. We're a science-based company. We love standards. For us, it's ISO 14067 life cycle analysis. We have in-house expertise. We've trained ourselves up to do this. We used to do it externally, get people to do it for us. It's becoming not quite a license to operate, but it will be a license to operate in the foreseeable future. So it's not really answering the question if money was no object, but we are spending a very significant amount of time, effort and resource and money on exactly this kind of work, because the value will be realised more than it is today.
Stephen?
It's very hard to not make landfill or incineration cheaper than the recycling. So from a recycling point of view, it's very difficult from that perspective. It would be great if there could be, and I don't know how it's done, we find a way that everything could be recycled, together or collected together and handled in that way. And until you do that, it is very difficult to shift the paradigm. So we work with a retailer in France called Monoprix, where lots of different organic companies have come together, and they will accept any type of organic product for recycling. And so they've all funded this jointly. So they pay different amounts for different size companies. Smaller companies pay less than the bigger companies. And then the consumer can come back and recycle anything. So that could be a way if there was sort of a levy that lots of cosmetics companies sort of paid into, and everything could come back to one central point and be recycled, because that's the problem. This type of material does cost more to collect, separate and recycle than the end raw material is worth. But the figure I mentioned from the World Economic Forum earlier, the amount of single-use plastics that are lost is staggering. So we need to find a way to make the economics work.
And Neil?
Thanks. Well, I'll look at it from two different angles. What should we be doing more to be money no object? We'd like the government to back our industry a bit more. I've got some great ideas and great colleagues who are brilliant at R&D. They run packaging companies that have got materials. They'd like to do more with their materials. They'd like to invest in new technologies, but they haven't got perhaps the support or funding or subsidy. I'd like to see those startups being given more government backing and more support, because that's going to do all the things we're talking about. With a business as a startup, a small part of a large company, you can spend R&D money, you can invest, you can create new materials, you can create new markets. So I'd like to see our government backing the industry a bit more and giving us more support. Because I know great people have got good ideas. I know one or two of them are champing at the bits to get going, but they need that backing. What do we do in the industry side? Money, no object. Well, as I said, it never really is no object. But were it to be that, I've always believed in innovation. I always think the personal care industry has been great at innovating. I'd like to see more innovation in all the things we've been talking about. I'd like to see the packaging in totally biodegradable or compostable or reusable packaging. I'd like to see more plant-based materials on the shelf. I'd like to see packs that are novel, innovative and creative that maybe aren't the most cost-effective solution to produce, but they still look great on the shelf to attract the consumer to buy. So I think we are doing a good job innovating, but there's still more to do. And were the money not an issue, I think that's going to be an area we should be doing more going forward. Innovate, create, and do all the things we've been talking about to make materials more sustainable.
And lastly, I'd like to hear from each of you who you think is doing a good job. And if you dare, who's not, in terms of sustainability?
Well, I would say Keraol and Dr. Kraft, of course, yeah. There are numerous companies out there, and one of the things that really irritates me as a scientist, is the amount of sales literature out there that is pseudoscience, And I won't point fingers at any particular companies, but there are lots of people out there that sell things where you look at the science and it's very, very dodgy. And really, I think those sorts of things should be stamped out pretty quickly. One of the key things I think that we need to be doing is doing much more on consumer education for all of these things, because at the end of the day, those are the people that spend the money that buy the products. If they know which products to buy because it's recyclable or because it's green or sustainable or whatever, then the problem goes away. But the problem is they don't, and we're not producing enough products that are truly sustainable to actually really allow all that to happen. So, afraid I haven't really answered your question, but that's it's an important thing to say, I think.
Well, I think I've said it already. I think the personal care industry as a whole, certainly the leading personal care consumer product companies, can be proud of their achievement so far. There are some industry-leading programs. There are some laggards, but they will catch up, because if they don't, they won't be the same company in 5 or 10 years' time as they are today. And our industry bodies, it's just worth a mention here, our industry bodies, certainly Cosmetics Europe, publish some good stuff on encouraging smaller companies to adopt, putting structure around sustainability programs and helping them. And the Personal Care Product Council in North America that I'm involved with is doing more. So I think the personal care industry can be proud of its achievements. It will never be doing enough, but it's doing a good job so far. And I compare it and contrast it also with other industries that I get involved in, who are non-consumer facing businesses, who are nowhere near, in many cases, the personal home and personal care industry.
Stephen?
I've already mentioned a few of the brands that fund some of our sort of free programs, and we're working with on things like the ocean plastics and beach plastics. We're in 21 markets around the world. We work with pretty much any major conglomerate you can kind of mention. Not in every single market we're in, but they have to fund it at a local level for us to offer a solution. So I don't really want to say who I think is doing a bad job or a good job, because a brand that isn't working with us today, we'd love to work with them tomorrow, because while there isn't the infrastructure to recycle things at a municipal level, it involves these brands funding these programs, which they don't have to do. So there's brands doing good, there's brands not doing as much as they could, but we are open to working with any of them until there is the infrastructure out there to recycle everything. So and again, I haven't really answered your question, but
it's fair enough. It's the cheeky question. Go on, Neil.
Okay, right, cheeky question. Right, okay. I like what L'Oreal are doing at the moment. I mean, this new pack I've banged on a bit earlier about the one that's the toiletry, the cosmetic, the shampoo bottle, a range on the shelf that's made out of not plastics but out of corrugated paper and board. Well, that's good to me. Whether it's going to be a big winner remains to be seen. But what it says to me is they're prepared to listen to what the consumer's telling them, They're listening to what the market's saying. They're responding to challenges and innovating in new materials. And I would think that's probably, to me, a good enough example of one company who seems to have embraced the challenge, as Procter and Gamble have done, as we've talked about with the washing up liquid, the ocean, 10% ocean plastic and 90% post-consumer waste plastic. So the big guys have got the budget. Of course they have. They've got the money. They've got the R&D departments, huge. But they're listening, I hope. And I would say let's all take on board what they're doing and try and do more of it if we're not doing it ourselves or our companies or the industry isn't doing it. Because if we don't, we're going to be in a pretty different state in 30 years' time. I don't quite know where it all will take us, but it's certainly a challenge at the moment to get these things right.
And just to round off our discussion, if we came back to this table in 10 years' time, what would it look like if we've done a good job? Chris, go for it.
Population growth moving from the 7.5 or so billion on the planet today to somewhere between 9 and 10 by 2050 represents an enormous challenge for the world and planetary boundaries. For the consumer product industry, the opportunity, of course, is that rather less than perhaps relevant than the absolute number, the fact that there'll be 1 billion more consumers who enjoy the same level of consumerism that we do, which is an enormous opportunity for the consumer product industry. Which means the consumer product industry has to, in order for it to be sustainable and sustained, has to, well, there is one company who talks about doubling in size and halving its environmental footprint, which means staying where it is today in terms of its environmental footprint, but doubling in size. The consumer product industry, personal care and home care, has to really get its head around sustainability and ensure that it doesn't enlarge its environmental footprint. Otherwise, it won't be able to take advantage of the extra billion consumers that will be on offer.
And Chris?
Yeah, I think we will be a lot more restricted in what we can and can't do. Yeah, and that will feed into this kind of thing where if companies say they're going to grow or they really have to control their carbon footprint, their environmental footprint much more closely. And I'm sure there'll be more regulation towards that from both the sort of national and international level. I think that will help focus the minds quite a lot. At the moment, I think people haven't really got there on all of that, but I think in 10 years' time, it will be right up there. First thing everybody thinks about is the sort of environmental impact, and I hope that's how things go.
And Stephen?
For me, it would have to be a big reduction in single-use plastics and also a big increase in recycling rates. Recycling rates have been pretty stagnant now for the last few years, and we need to massively improve upon that if we're going to make any significant difference.
And Neil?
Get the recycling rates up is absolutely right. I mean, the plastic recycling rates in the UK are pretty poor. Other parts of Europe do far better than we do, Germany being a great example to us all. So certainly improve that. But to do that, you've got to get the infrastructure right. And you've got to understand the different processes, the different materials, how they can be separated, how they can be, more effectively reproduced in and a material that's going to be usable in the closed loop. And we talked about closed loop before, and it didn't really happen 4 or 5 years ago. Closed loop companies didn't quite get it right, and some went bust, and some... It's starting to come back, and I think the closed loop is really a key to all this. And I do hope in 10 years' time we've got a circular... We use the word circular economy. Don't always understand it, perhaps, but I want us all to have that circular economy, that closed loop. So we're using materials now which are reappearing in those markets in a few years' time, in a similar product, in a similar environment, and in a similar material.
Okay, well, thank you to my guests, Chris Sayner, Chris Rayner, Stephen, and Neil Farmer for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.